Hey everybody, welcome to a very special Friday night Zenny 62, which I think is quite appropriate uh, considering what we're about to talk about, okay? And this is the man. And first of all, before I officially introduce him, I'm just going to tweet out real quick where we're at. And there is the share, and I'm sharing it from my face. This is Robin Block. Robin, how are you?
I'm really good. Thank you ever so much for having me on your show. The only thing I just want to caveat this entire conversation and say it's Friday. We're crowdfunding, which is crazy, and it's 1 a.m. in the morning. And so just forgive me a little bit if I stumble on my words slightly.
Oh, hey, not a problem. And tell my viewers, first of all, how this great project started.
Wow. Okay. Well, there's a little bit of a backstory to it. So I've run media businesses for the last 15 years, and my wife's Australian. We spent a year in Australia last year. I've got a young daughter, and so we went over there for a bit. When I came back to London, where I'm from, I was looking to start a new business, and I'm 40 years old now, so I wanted to do something which I was going to find meaningful. And so I started a business called Creator VC. And what we do is we create long form content for special interest audiences. And so if you think about media at the moment, like I bet your Instagram feed is exactly tailored to you, like your tastes. There's probably not someone else in the world with an Instagram feed exactly like yours. That's your kind of media fingerprint. And what's happening is that the way we consume content and the stuff we're into is becoming more and more personalized, more and more narrowcast, and that's special interest. And when you get pockets of deep engagement, you can use mechanisms like crowdfunding and work with that audience to create content they'll be delighted with. So that's the business that I've started. So my first project was a feature-length documentary about 1980s action movies called In Search of the Last Action Heroes, which has just finished production in LA. We've got people like Mario Casar, Bill Duke.
Whoa,
Cynthia
Bill
Rothrock,
Duke, the legend.
The legend.
I love
Duke,
Bill.
Who is a legend.
Sorry.
Who doesn't love Bill?
Yeah.
Bill Duke, but, a whole bunch of amazing people, and that's coming out next year. So I finished funding for that in July, and I had such a great experience on that project. I thought, what do I want to do next? And I knew that the new Halloween movie was coming out, on the calendar. I thought, well, I've got enough prep time to develop a project around 1980s horror. And the real clincher for me was that I was born in the late 70s, but I kind of grew up in the 80s, and I have very distinct and powerful memories of my first exposure to horror movies from the time. And I realized that there was a lot of people around my age, 35, 40, who were looking back to the 80s as a source of nostalgia, as a source of comfort in many ways. And we were sharing stories about, the first time we saw Evil Dead or the first time we saw Freddy. And I thought there's really something there. And if you look at the 80s, the sort of global time warp that we seem to be in with Stranger Things, Ready Player One, The New Karate Kid, like there is definitely a cyclical nature to it. So our parents' generation would have been the 1950s. But for our generation, and Zenny, I'm going to include you in this. It's the 80s. It's a very powerful decade. There's a lot of correlations between what was happening sociopolitically then, what's happening now, and in many ways it felt like a simpler time. It was before the internet, before the complexity that we're faced nowadays, and so I think people generally have a deep affection for it. And in terms of horror movies, the 80s was just a magical decade.
What was the, in your view, linchpin movie of that time, and how does your documentary begin to capture the magic of the 80s?
Wow. Okay. So two quite challenging questions. All right. So the linchpin movie. God,
I mean, I know what it was for me. That's why I say.
Well, I won't. I'll pick. You could pick Evil Dead, which was 1981, but it probably wasn't the linchpin movie for the horror genre of the 80s. Perhaps that happened a bit later. Perhaps that was the thing in 1984. But your other question was about how do you capture the spirit of the 80s? And we've been very lucky. We have a world-class lineup of talent. We have some incredible names on board. We have Heather Langenkamp from Nightmare on Elm Street. We've got Barbara Crampton from Re-Animator and From Beyond. We've got Joe Dante from Gremlins, Howling. We've got, I'm going to miss Tom Savini, who was like the amazing makeup and prosthetics guy. We've got just Larry Cohen, who did the stuff, and Lloyd Kaufman from Troma. I can give you a who's who. I'm going to miss people out and get in trouble. But we've got a world-class lineup of talent. But you would expect that with a documentary about 80s horror. What's unique about this film is that we're bringing three groups of stakeholders together for the first time in documentary history. We're bringing 80s horror icons together. We're bringing modern horror greats. So we've got Lee Whannell from Insidious and Saw, who recently directed Upgrade, great movie. We've got Ryan Turek from Blumhouse. He is the associate producer behind the new Halloween.
Yes.
He's the guy that helped bring it into existence. And we've also got this third group of stakeholders, which I believe is very, very important. And it's what we call the horror influencers. So this encapsulates the editors of all the major horror press, some major horror YouTubers. So we have Found Flicks, which is one of the biggest horror YouTube channels in the world, 1.1 million subscribers. We've got Good Bad Flicks, and we've got some merchandisers. We've got Ben Scrivens from Fright Rags, Spencer Hickman from Deathwalks Records. So and the thing about horror is you're either in horror or you're not. And the people that are making this project possible are our backers, and they're the hardcore fans. They're the ones that really identify with 80s horror. And we've been very blessed with the lineup because it's working.
Wow. Hey, so have you had a chance to go through an inventory and talk and just say, is it? Let me ask this question a different way. What's the movie really about? Yeah. I mean, when I walk into the movie, what do you want me to see?
Not just what I want you to see, it's how do I want you to feel?
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And I can tell you how I want you to feel. I want you to watch our film and go off and have a 12-hour 80s horror movie marathon. I want it to be a love letter to 1980s horror. I want it to, that era was visceral. And I'm not just talking about the movies, I'm talking about the aesthetic, the music, the cover art. These are the days, like kids nowadays don't know the pain of playing Russian roulette at Blockbuster. Like you'd go down and you'd pick the video with the best cover art and you'd get back and it would be terrible. But you had to watch it because you didn't have on demand and nothing was on demand. That was your only entertainment, right? And so, that was a glorious time. And so it's that feeling, but we're going to talk about things that have never been talked about. We're looking at the socio-political context. We're looking at some of the subtext and themes. The 1980s was a fascinating era from a historical context. So we're weaving this all through into a narrative. But for me, I know I will have succeeded when at the end of this experience, you are pumped for 80s horror.
Hey, have you had a chance to meet or maybe talk to Adam Green? He made a series of movies called Hatchet 1, 2, and 3, and they are parodies of 80s horror films. And it seems like the two of you would have a lot to talk about in terms of how you view 80s horror. I'm just curious.
I haven't. And we've been very, there's so many people that I would have great conversations with that I haven't had to yet. He'll be one of them.
And what is it, like, for me, the definitive 80s horror movie isn't really exactly 80s. It was actually made in 78, but I saw it as a freshman at Texas Arlington the fall of 1980, and it's Halloween. And I'll tell you the context in which I saw it. It was the midnight movie at UTA. Me and my roommate Reggie went down, and look, a couple of freshman Joes, you know, in search of girls, right? And you think, where the girls hang out? Oh yeah, the midnight movie, and of course it's the sorority girls. So we were sitting in behind these gorgeous Zetas. Zetas is a sorority house, and then the movie started. And Robin, I have to tell you, he and I screamed because they screamed. And then we looked at each other and we thought, why are we screaming? They're not, oh! It was that kind of, Halloween was that kind of movie. I mean, have we lost our ability to really scare people? Are 80s movies like Halloween or Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street, what have we lost? And why is it we're drawn back to the 80s so much?
It's a really good question. And so I'm just going to caveat this, but by saying this is my own subjective, flawed opinion on it, right? So for me, when I first watched Halloween when I was probably 11 or 12 years old, I found it to be quite a frightening movie. There's certainly some very effective jump scares, expertly paced. But nowadays, no, I wouldn't find it scary. And I went to see the recent Halloween movie, and that isn't necessarily scary. A horror film doesn't need to scare you to be effective. The new Halloween is a very good movie. It was like seeing an old friend and catching up, and it does a stellar job at bringing you back into that universe. And so context is a really key thing. When I first watched The Evil Dead, I remember where I was. My friend Jamie had brought the VHS over. I was lying on the sofa and I jumped out of my skin. Okay. And I must have been about 12 or 13. I remember it and I literally jumped. Now I'm 40 years old. I went to see The Evil Dead at the cinema a few years ago, and it wasn't frightening. It was comforting. And the reason it was comforting, and this is what's really powerful about 80s horror, is the nostalgia. It connects you back to a time when the world wasn't what you thought it is now, what you think it is now. Like, you were different. I really do believe that horror movies are most effective when you're younger and you're more impressionable. And the second part of your answer is, are movies as scary now? But it's all relative, because, what would have, an audience at the time in the 80s would have been far less desensitized than we are now. If you want to watch a horror movie, turn on the news.
Right.
Right. Okay. So, it's hard for horror to compete. And I think that's why we're seeing a trend, which is really to do with jump scares. But there's been a few horror movies that have come out in the last decade that have been incredibly affecting, Paranormal Activity.
Yes.
Katie Featherston from Paranormal Activity is going to be in the documentary. Another one.
Congratulations.
Obviously Insidious. And we've got Lee Wanell from Insidious in our film as well. But Insidious was, personally for me, I'm a grown man. I had to keep the light on. And with Paranormal Activity really, really just, and I watched it on my own. Never watch that movie on your own. If you haven't seen Paranormal Activity, don't watch it on your own. Bring a support group around you, because it's hardcore.
Wow.
And probably
I have to admit, I haven't seen it. What is it about Paranormal Activity that's so scary?
It's just expertly done. It's just it's the concept, the premise, the delivery. It just I highly recommend that movie if you genuinely want to be frightened. So it's a white knuckle ride. By the end, you're just like, you want to get through it. But a film that I saw recently, it's a few years old now, which is probably the last movie that deeply affected me in terms of just, sometimes a movie it's like a visceral experience, it will stay with you.
Yeah.
It Follows. Great movies are like onions. Okay, so they have many layers.
See, the original
And you
Halloween
can
was like that for me.
the original Halloween. You get these movies. Halloween is one of them. The
Mm-hmm.
Thing is another.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much anything that Carpenter did in the 80s is like this. These are movies that are fossilized in amber. Okay, they're perfect universes, which is why they've stood the test of time. You know, not every 80s horror movie that we are nostalgic about, I can watch as an adult and enjoy and maintain my attention span. But there are certain movies from that decade which are timeless,
Hey,
and not just limited to horror. I mean, I went recently to the cinema to see the original Predator.
yes.
Phenomenal film, and it was like the first time I was experiencing it again. It was again fossilized in amber. It's a perfect universe, and sometimes just the magic happens, and you know these films, you know, have that capability. And it's rare and it's special, and we should treasure it.
Would you classify, even though it hugs the '80s and it kind of marks the beginning of it, Aliens and Alien, in that series, which takes us through the '80s, is that horror or is that science fiction?
It's sci-fi horror. It's not horror sci-fi. And I'll make that distinction because I'm probably going to do a 80s sci-fi documentary to complete the trilogy at some point next year, which we would love to cover. So Michael Biehn is in our 80s action documentary. And so obviously he was in Aliens and Terminator.
Yeah.
But we think of Terminator more as an action movie in our context. It's really hard to argue about these films because genre is subjective. And there's films that I didn't include in the trailer for our documentary. And people asked online, you know, our trailer's been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. And, you know, we didn't include The Shining. And the reason, and The Shining is one of my all-time favorite films, but I don't think of it as a typical 80s horror because it's a Stanley Kubrick movie. It's sort of elevated.
Interesting.
You know,
right.
But then when I talk about it out loud, it's very hard to argue that point because it's highly subjective. But ultimately, when I think about 80s horror, I think of like The Return of the Living Dead. I think of Nightmare on Elm Street. I think of, you know, Halloween 2. I think of you know, Friday the 13th. Like that, the Re-Animator, From Beyond, those sort of movies. You know, that's what I think about when I think of 80s horror. And there is a collective universe where there's a shared sense of aesthetic, there's a shared sense of experience. These are serious movies. They might have comedic elements to it, but there is a soul there. There is something tangible and intrinsic to that genre. And that's exactly what we want to tap into. It's that onion. It's got layers. There's reasons why certain themes come through. And what's amazing is there's a whole new generation that are discovering these movies that absolutely adore them.
Is it that, also, let me switch to another question. The phenomenon of the Scream Queen took on another level in the 80s. But is that something that you are focusing on as well as to how is it fair to refer to Scream
story.
Queen?
I wonder if I can tell this. I'm sure Barbara wouldn't mind. So, Scream Queen, the term Scream Queen is actually a controversial term, and it's a term that we've stopped using.
Yes.
So I was talking to Barbara Crampton the other day about this, and we were delighted to have her on board. And I was because we did this little tribute video to her to announce her involvement, and I put it up on Twitter, and she pinged me on email saying, "Can you remove the part about me being a Scream Queen?" Right? So I put that in the tweet, and then next to it, she'd sent me a link to an article she'd done in bloodydisgusting.com.
Right.
And the article was titled don't call me a screen queen, right? And so one of my advisors is a wonderful, wonderful woman called Heather Wixson, who's the editor of Daily Dead, and she was laughing when I told her the story. She was like, I should have told you, Barbara never likes to be called a screen queen. But and you know what, I said, you know, it was my ignorance. I didn't know. I do know now. But then, you know, Caroline Williams doesn't have any issue with it. She goes,
Right.
"That's why I
Neither
gave
does
it to her."
Daniel Harris, who was in Hatchet, the Hatchet series, and also was in Halloween the remake. You know, and I know this because I interviewed her my first Comic-Con in a limousine. She had no issue with it, and she has a fascinating take on life, but that's another story. You know, but my question is, you know, having said that, is it dishonest to the culture of the '80s to, you know, ignore certain terms that are not apropos today?
It's a really good question. It's something that we're totally going to discuss. There's a couple of things that have come out of this.
Yeah.
You know, on the one hand, I'm making a movie for myself. I'm making a movie that I would want to watch. That's going to get me energized and get me pumped. But on the other hand, I can't allow my own ignorance around these matters that people care deeply about to, you know, like, so this journey with this project is actually, and I have a young daughter as well. You know, we're living in a time where gender issues, gender equality is real. Like, these are, you know, it was a different time back then. You know, there's things and behaviors that were accepted in the 80s that weren't would not be acceptable now. We're living in a different time. And I'm making a film that's a love letter to the 80s, but I'm not necessarily going to sugarcoat everything. Our final stretch goal on Kickstarter is to do a bonus chapter celebrating iconic women from 80s horror. And, you know, one of the questions we've got is what was acceptable then, which wouldn't be now. You know, Caroline Williams just emailed me yesterday with her answers, because we're going to do a little editorial about it. And it's a fascinating subject. Heather Langenkamp, you know, has a real strong perspective. It's an issue that she cares about, and you have to respect that. You know, so as much as we're writing a love letter to 80s horror, we're looking at it from the context of where we are now. I'll give you an example. The artwork for the documentary, if you go to Kickstarter, it's the first image you see. That was, I commissioned an artist called Graham Humphreys, who is like a iconic horror illustrator. All the big franchises that came over to Europe, he did the artwork for. So if you know, incredible artist. But my brief to him was like, can you just do a picture with all like the monsters from 80s horror? And I can tell you the artwork is amazing. It's amazing, right? He knocked it out of the park. But both Barbara and Heather said, you know what? Why isn't any women on there? You know, and I was stumped, and I realized that it hadn't even entered my tiny mind. Now, I spoke to Graham about this because I was filming an interview for the documentary with him as well, and he gave a really good answer, which I'll probably misappropriate if I go into. But he basically said, you know, this was looking at that time then. You know, the monsters were the male psyche. You know, and they were mostly male monsters. You know, there was just monsters on this poster, so there was some validity around why we did the poster, how we did it. But my understanding now is actually both Barbara and Heather had a really good point, you know, and it's something now that we're going to use. If we can reach our last stretch goal, it's something we'll talk about, you know. It'll become, you know, and I think that's what's quite special about this. We're not just making one film that's going to be on Netflix. We're doing a special extended version for the Blu-ray and DVD, which will be 3 hours plus long. And it's for the fans. It's for the super fans. And that's what's wonderful about special interest media, is you can go to town, you can go down the rabbit hole.
I realized I'm going to take a liberty with this medium and switch this camera around to an interesting perspective. And the reason is that, you can now see me talking with Robin here, and then it's more. This is kind of a cool perspective. I always wanted to try, but it gives us a chance to have this two-way, right? And
I can't see your phone, unfortunately.
oh, but can you see right? You can see. Oh, the phone is here.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Wow, so we're going
Right.
into
So it's
infinity.
yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. But like the viewer, when you see this, when the viewer sees this on YouTube, you'll see my face and you, and you'll see an actual computer. But it's like we're all three talking, you know. But when I think about women in '80s horror, I don't think. And maybe this is because I'm 56 and you're 40. I don't know. Am I 16 years older than you are? No.
You're
That's
aging backwards.
I'm
I don't
aging
know. I
back.
don't
That's
get it.
weird, man. I don't feel that. I just, but I think when I think about it, Robin, is that I think of women then like maybe like Jamie Lee Curtis. I think of her as heroic, but I've never thought of her as less. You know what I'm saying? I never thought of her. And
No,
I
I
know.
know. Nor have I. Like, it's that you think about the character of Laurie Strode. You think about Kirsty from Nightmare on Elm Street. You think about sorry, not Kirsty, Nancy
Yeah.
from Nightmare on Elm Street, and it's Kirsty from Hellraiser.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to bring in aliens, then you've got Ripley.
Yeah.
So you've actually got four of the most iconic female characters ever in one decade. And that is something that it's our responsibility to look at as part of this film.
Yeah.
And luckily, we've got a stellar lineup of iconic 80s kick-ass women. We've got Kelli Maroney from Chopping Mall and Night of the Comet. She's amazing. And so, it's kind of my horizon has been expanded, and I've been asked questions that I didn't have an answer for, that I've had to go away and go, where do you stand on this? And realize, actually, we need to bring this into this project for it to be full-bodied.
Hey, what about is it can you look at also, because I think of one black actors in there. The reason why I say that is this, because if you remember Nightmare on Elm Street, and then if you remember,
We've got Ken Sagos.
yeah, and if you remember, there's I think
He's in it.
I think it was Friday the 13th Part 5, and they finally get a black character, and it's this guy that actually decides he's going to try to kick Jason's ass. And it was fascinating to me that of all the characters, when they get to a black character, they think, this is a black dude that actually kick his ass, he's going to try. You know what I mean? What is it about, what do horror movies say about the American psychology with respect to race, in your view? And,
wow. Next time you do an interview, you got to send the questions over, brother.
You got it, man. Okay. This is off the top of my head, though. That's kind of like...
All right, so number one, right, Keith David.
Yes.
Keith David. Right?
Yes.
They Live, The Thing. I've never spoken to him. We haven't approached him for this.
I've interviewed him. He's a great guy.
He's a great guy, right?
Yeah.
I saw him at a London Comic Con and just looks super cool. What's my view on it? My view on it is very clear. From a racial perspective, black people were underrepresented in these movies. They were, but it was a product of its time. And I think when we do our interview with Ken Sagos, who was in Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and 4, he will have a perspective as being a black actor known for horror movies. And it's something, so I think it's all changed now. We've got Jordan Peele.
Yeah.
God, do you know what I watched last night? I watched...
Did you see Get Out?
Get Out is just... that's going to be a movie that people go back to in 20 years from now. 20 years from now, you and I will be chatting about Get Out, and I will have done a documentary about the best from the year, whatever that came out. that document. But so I watched, last night I watched I'm veering off on a tangent, so stop me, but I watched Black Klansman.
Yeah, was it good? I haven't seen it yet. I've been.
Well, Spike Lee's one of
I
my
love
favorite
Spike.
filmmakers.
Yeah, I love Spike.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So from Do the Right Thing,
Mhm.
even from She's Gotta Have It, actually, like Do the Right Thing really influenced me when I was a teenager. And when I got into college, I got in because I wrote about that film. I found it a great movie. Highly recommend Black Klansman, and it made me emotional at the end. And I won't tell
Wow.
you why.
Why?
But,
Can I
like,
ask why it made you emotional? Why?
Two things that upset me. So I went to see Michael Moore's documentary this week, Fahrenheit 11/9, and that painted a very dark picture of where we are in the world. And as a Brit in London, the view of America is tainted. I love America. I love it. I've spent my first time with America was 16 years ago. I was in Compton. Then I did a film about 50 Cent in Southside Jamaica, Queens. Did a film about Biggie. Spent time with Ed Lover and Dr. Dre. Like, was shown a lot of love by people over there. And as a white man who grew up in a relatively middle class environment, you go into some of those areas in America, and it's not a joke. You realize it humbles you. If you're a fan of black culture and black music, and you sort of, to an extent, the lifestyles can be glorified. But when you visit those areas, you think, it's not a joke. This is really how the world is. It was humbling. And so I'm sort of veering off. So going back to this 80s black actors in 80s horror, I think that in that sense, we're starting to come quite far now.
I agree.
And I think, we're living in a different world. I live in London. London's a really multicultural city.
Yeah.
It would be.
I've never visited. I love to visit. I really have.
Do you know what? Right, the idea of obvious racism would never. From my perspective, I don't see it with any other, white people. I just don't see it really.
Right.
In London. When you go out of London into the countryside, maybe you get it a little bit, but whenever I've been to America, I've seen it straight away. It's just, and it's just unusual. The first time I was 24 years old, I was making a film about Dr. Dre in Compton. And I was in Compton, and I was with a guy called Lonzo Williams, who's in...
Why have I heard that name?
So Lonzo owned the club Eve After Dark, where Dr. Dre met Eazy-E.
That's why I've heard that name, folks.
He's in the movie, right?
Uh-huh.
And Lonzo Williams is one of the coolest people I've ever met in my life, right? And he really looked after me when I was in Compton. But what I realized when I was down there is that I'd go into that area, and we were in an area I think called Kelly Park, where Dre grew up in, and it's a really black area. There's no sort of mixing, and there's kids that have grown up in Compton that have never been out of Compton. That their whole universe is there. And what I took from that experience is I went down there and I was like, what is that guy doing here? And the mentality was, what have we done wrong that you're here? Yeah. And I was like, and I didn't get it at first. And then I understood, and I was like, wow, the world's a bit screwed up. But I've got to tell you that, as someone that went out there, I was treated so well by the community, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot about life. I learned a lot about people. And I think in some ways we're making really some significant strides forward. Yes. But in other ways we're going totally backwards. And it's something that is, especially now I'm a father, I'm like, makes me really upset.
I'm right there with you. Hey, I'm just curious, shifting gears a bit. What about the role of dogs in horror movies? And the reason why I say that is because it's always the dog. If you want to know that there's a badass out there, you send your dog out there and the dog doesn't come back. I mean, somebody's, it's like the dog's like, rah, 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 and it's like, hey.
The only thing I can think of is The Thing.
Yeah.
It starts off with a dog.
Yeah.
And even it wasn't a remake, but the one that came out a few years ago emulated that scene as homage, I think. But that's all I've got to say about that. I am not a subject matter expert. I don't even have an opinion of any value about animals in horror movies in general, apart from it really bothers me to see any animal suffer, not in real life, but like suffer in the movie.
But
more than people.
But it occurs to me, and this is something that, you're thinking about documentary comparison, but it just occurred to me off the top of my head that of the modern horror films I've seen, they don't depict how pets react. But the 80s were replete with examples.
Pet Cemetery, the cat.
You had the numerous Friday the 13th where the dogs were out or barking. I mean, dogs were so much a part. Right.
Cujo.
Right.
Monkey Shine.
Yeah. I mean, they're all over the place. So, I mean, it's something that, I don't mean to say, well, I'm just saying that it's an element there that it seems like would be cool to explore, Maybe I'm wrong.
I'm not sold. I mean, like,
you're not sold on it. I get you. Yeah.
I'd have to interview an animal. I have to interview a dog. I don't know how good. What's this? Like, what are you gonna do? Like the. I don't know. I think I'm gonna thank you for your suggestion, but let me make my damn movie myself.
Yeah, you got it. No problem. See, the sequel will be directed by me. Just kidding. Anyway.
Yeah.
So, how far are you along with this in terms of funding? What are your release objectives?
Okay,
and how can we help?
So we do this live. This is a live stream.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I will log on to Kickstarter right now.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So right now we are, and this is UK pounds, £78,086.
Congratulations.
We've got 1,219 backers. The stretch goal that we're going for is 90,000. So we've got just under 48 hours to raise another 11, well, to be honest, raise another £12,000. But with Kickstarters, they start. I mean, we raised 25,000 in 48 hours, and so I think the 90K, which is our stretch goal, so we can make the bonus chapter about iconic women in 80s horror. That's 90,000. So fingers crossed, we'll get there.
Wow. Hey, this is really an exciting project, and I want to come back and talk to you about it again. Just maybe as soon as maybe next week. We do another one. Just kind of give an update. Keep getting the word out there.
Yeah, right. Okay, on the proviso that you don't ask me crazy hard questions. This is that I've done a whole month of like really nice little podcasts. Everyone's been loving it. Like we've had race, we've had like how many hard questions can you ask a guy in one interview? So
oh man, I was just getting warm. I was just kidding.
This is like you're like in Waterham Slip and Dark and like, oh my gosh, right. Do I win something at the end of this? What happens?
Well, hey, that's a great idea. I'll get a sponsor, and I'll, we'll have, that'll be a great one. No, I just think that horror films are the best representation of a culture ever, particularly in America, because you get all of the isms that are baked into the movie, and
you're 100% correct, and that's what's so interesting.
Yeah. And I don't mean that as a bad thing because Paul Zimmerman, who's was a great sports writer for Sports Illustrated, died yesterday, and I had the pleasure of interviewing him in 2006 on the only YouTube video, out there of interview, 6 minutes, 17-second interview, and the man. I mean, you could look at it. You could look at the interview two ways. You could either say, as I did, hey, this guy has a frank view about race and sex, or you can say he's racist and sexist. Because I asked him, hey, what is it that is different about the NFL? And I expected him, since he wrote some very famous strategic books, right? I expect him to say, well, it's the 4-3 defense or the Bear defense, yada, yada, yada. Instead, he said, well, it's a black game and not a white game. I mean, it was very in your face. He said it went from being a strength game to a speed game. And then at the time that I interviewed him, Katie Couric was just signed on to do the CBS Evening News, and she got this like humongous 5-year, $75 million contract. And he said, so he was ranting about it. So he's like, hey, why does she work this? And I said, well, he says, she's just a pretty face. What does she do? So you see what I'm getting at? But my point is that horror movies are a lot like that. They speak to you in a way that's raw, that maybe like your older parents might speak about society when their filters taken off of them from being young. They're older and they're kind of like, you know what, I've done my time.
I've got a question for you.
Yeah,
if you don't mind.
Yeah,
right?
Not at all.
So how do you are there horror movies from the 80s where you see yourself? Are you represented in that? Are you represented now?
No, I have never seen one horror movie that represents a smart-ass black guy. Okay, I never have. I mean, the one I mentioned, Friday the 13th, is like it's like the athletic, fast black guy, or Nightmare on Elm Street, though, that who can beat up people who tries, right? But a guy who basically has a Jewish last name, who's got a brain, who thinks in terms of in complex ways and that sort of thing, as a scientist. I haven't seen that. Now, have I seen it in science fiction? I did see it with Terminator to a degree, right? When Joe Morris, I think his name, played the guy that created Skynet, I think it was, all right?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? Okay. But I don't see me. I'm used to not seeing me, Robin. I'm very used to not seeing me. It's funny, no one ever asked me that question before. I'm so used to not seeing me, it's David Aguirre. I've never seen me.
Again, going back to the environment we're in now, I know nothing about NFL. The only sport I'm evangelical about is boxing.
Oh, who's your favorite boxer?
Oh man, that's such a hard question. All right. So I've got my father ran the British Boxing Board of Control.
Oh wow!
So I grew up with boxing. Yeah, so like I love it. I love it. I don't really have a. I think that I love the fight. I love the psychology behind it, and I love the characters. And it's about life, isn't it?
It is.
It's deep and it's visceral and it's not a million miles away from horror movies. I feel like the fighter tells you a lot about the time that he's in.
Mm-hmm. Do you consider Ultimate Fighting boxing?
What's that?
Do you consider Ultimate Fighting boxing?
I went to see a UFC match like a few years ago when they started doing the shows in London. And I think it's a phenomenal promotion. Dana White's been, an incredible leader, but it's not something I follow because it's, I'm so biased. It's unreal.
Yes.
Like when Mayweather floored McGregor, I watched it for spectacle. But it was never going to be a fight. And I mean, don't get me wrong, these guys, this Khabib guy wrestling with a bear and like next level stuff. I'm just like, whoa, but boxing, I understand. Like when it goes to the ground game or wrestling, it's too many disciplines and I can't follow what's going on. Whereas boxing, I understand what's going on. And I can follow it. I can read the fight to a degree. Mm-hmm. Whereas the most interesting part for something like a UFC fight for me is when they are boxing. As soon as it goes to choking or ground game or whatever it is, like I lose interest, or it becomes just a spectacle of violence for me because I'm not educated about it. There'll be people out there that are like hardcore UFC fans that can read what's going on and can. It's like jazz. It's if you can hear it, then you can. what did George Foreman say? He said, you know, the boxing's like jazz. The better it is, the more people don't like it. You know,
Yeah.
because they turn up to see sort of brutality, and you realize it's like ballet.
Yeah, that's well said. You mentioned George Foreman because that speaks to the era of boxing that I
would say George
used to,
Foreman
and Muhammad Ali. You know.
Well, okay, so Muhammad, I'm going to be contrarian, right? So
Sure.
Muhammad Ali is elevated, like he's more than a boxer.
Yes.
Right? He's elevated, right? But George Foreman, what I admire about him is the determination and strength of character, and the fact that there's an incredible film called When We Were Kings.
Yes.
Which won an Oscar, and incredible film, and it charts the journey of the Rumble in the Jungle, right? Don King's in it. You've got like of the time. You've got the elite sort of black entertainers,
right?
In Muhammad Ali, and it's quite complex. But you've got this central character, George Foreman, who's like this just force of nature, just knocking over everybody. Doesn't talk. Very monosyllabic, and you look at that young man then, and you compare that to who George Foreman transformed into as a man in life, public life, and what he's done with his life, and the positive things he's done, and who he is in American life. They're two separate people. So I love the personality of how you can start here, end here.
Yeah.
So take a look. Whenever I follow him on Twitter, and whenever he talks about Ali, he's just so. There's people that will pretend to be gracious, right? And then there's like George Foreman who will realize that experience benefited him.
Yeah. Oh, completely.
And it's humbling. It's disarming.
Muhammad Ali held me when I was 2 years old in Chicago.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was my first exposure to the idea, and as a kid growing up in Chicago, and someone who at 6 years old thought, hey, how come blacks aren't coaching football rather than playing? I mean, because my grandfather said, oh, hey, you should play football. And I said, no, because we're playing. I don't want to, I would rather coach. But my point is that the reason why I pointed to Ali for myself is because he was bigger than the sport. So much so that I didn't know what to do when he stopped boxing, so I didn't like boxing anymore, because there was no black person challenging the system around which boxing was created that basically told him to, go and be in his corner. It's for that reason. And I think similarly with horror, as much as I think of horror, as I said, reflecting the isms of life, it also, interesting in these stories, finds a way to create a space for that champion, be it a female, in many cases a female, and it makes light of those who do things that are really stupid, particularly like, having sex out in the dark in the middle of a campsite. What I mean?
Don't do that. Don't do that. Someone's gonna.
Right. It's like right. Oh, here it comes. Okay.
But it's really, you've really made me. You really made me think about race issues in horror movies in a way that I just hadn't really conceived of before this conversation. So I'm grateful to you for that.
Oh, thank you.
Because when we come and do that interview, I really wanted to get Jordan Peele as part of our modern horror great group of stakeholders, because he's flying the flag, isn't he? He's the guy.
Yeah.
And what I liked about Get Out is it took that consciousness, which I don't have because I'm not black, but presented it in a way that I could empathize with, right?
Yeah.
And that is clever, that's powerful, and I think that can only be a good thing. And it was a crossover movie.
Yeah, I think
you could watch it and be unaware of those issues.
Yeah.
Subconsciously, yeah.
It really hit home, because the ultimate horror for any of us is stepping into someone else's world. And what to me Get Out addresses is the horror of someone black stepping into a world that that person perceives. Know what I said? Perceives as white. Now, for me, as a guy who, was beat up when I was little for talking white, right? That was a different horror. I mean, my horror was leaving the apartment complex we lived in Chicago just to get a hamburger, and then because I felt someone who looked like me was going to beat me up for money. That was my horror. I mean, so that's what Get Out did a great job of is just showing how frightened we are of each other.
You know what? It's really true. It's really true what you're saying. I had a very different experience.
Mm-hmm.
So, if I would say when I was growing up, black culture was a really significant influence. The music and the filmmaking and everything like that. And because I didn't grow up in an area with many black people,
Mm-hmm.
we didn't. It was only really when I got to university that I sort of met people that had a different sort of. We shared the same love of the culture, but we came at it from different sides. And I was very fortunate enough in my 20s to meet a lot of relevant people in America and spend time in America around people that were not just, they were part of the culture, they were creating it.
Yeah.
And it was not my culture, but I didn't feel excluded from it. I felt like I could offer an opinion, I could appreciate it. And like you've always seen that with if you take jazz, for example,
Mm-hmm.
The jazz musicians in the 50s and 60s would always come over to Europe because they would have a very, very different level of appreciation.
Right.
And the racial thing wasn't there in Europe like it was in the States.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of thing. So like that's and it's all cyclical, so for me the 90s hip hop era was the one that's very just like 80s horror.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very nostalgic. I follow blogs now that dig up mixtapes from that era.
Oh, is that right? Huh.
Yeah, like I still, and it's I don't identify with it the same way I did when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
Where I would just listen to stuff, and like really think about the lyrics. But I just like I listened to a song the other day and it was Joey the Damager and it was a new one that he'd done. It was on SoundCloud,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just vibes. It was just so good, and he must be in his mid-40s, but it just took me straight back to that brilliance, that vibration. I don't know how else you would talk about it, but I was just like, look. So there's a whole generation of MCs now that we're all in our 40s.
Yeah, they just
but there's like Ed OG and like who are still pushing out
Mm-hmm.
music,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like really good. And so, but that's we totally veered off 80s horror. Sorry about that.
Well, no, I think because it all comes into, ultimately horror movies are about stories, personal stories, personally told, right? And about what scares us, which is the most personal thing of all. And I think, but it makes us think about lives, what we've experienced. It does for me because, many of my seminal moments growing up are around horror movies or horrific acts. Or acts I considered horrible. Having my bike stolen, that sort of thing. But then those are the things that create the foundations for what scares you, and then it ignites which movies get you. Like for me, the first Friday the 13th had for me one of the most scary movie scenes I've ever seen. That for me. And that was when one of the characters, and that's the thing about these movies, you don't remember you don't remember who got killed, right? You don't remember their names. You remember people who stayed alive. But this guy was in bed and he's sleeping in the campsite, and then this thing hits him like that, and he's like, right? I thought, oh, because then you're like looking under the bed, and I remember I had some dream, and in the middle of my dream I woke up and I said, I'm gonna kick your fucking ass if you're down there. Right? I mean, it's.
I've got one memory like that.
Yeah.
I was very young. I must have been about 12, and it was the first time I watched American Werewolf in London.
Oh, great movie. Yes, yeah. Whatever
Great
happened
movie, right?
to
Great
Dave
movie.
Naughton? Is he still with us?
Do you know what? I just posted a picture of him. I think
Yeah.
he is. I think he is. Right. But I remember this story. I remember it really well. I watched it, scared the hell out of me. And there's this in the movie. There's like the dead friend that appears in the mirror.
Yeah. Yes.
But I literally couldn't look in the mirror for weeks afterwards without being frightened of seeing. I didn't have any dead friends. Like it was just like an apparition.
Right.
So going back to this whole nostalgia thing with 80s horror, there's something very primal because a lot of us got exposed to it when we were younger, and now that we're older, it's harder for stuff to hit us like that.
Yeah, it is.
But we remember, and this is the
but
thing.
But that's stuff that hardens you, though. It hardens you.
It does,
right?
It hardens you.
Yeah.
And actually, on that point, the horror community have been amazing, and what I've learned is that horror movies are actually about belonging. You know, a lot of the time, people self-identify because it's an accepting community, and part of that is there's something very warm and comforting about seeing these movies now, especially ones that you've seen before. If you revisit, if I watch, you know, American Werewolf in London now, I doubt I'll be frightened in the same way, but I will remember back to when I first saw it, and it's that connection. And it's that connection, I believe, that's so powerful about this 80s revival.
Hey,
That's something we absolutely will tap into.
Hey, we were talking about horror stars. Did you have a chance to or reach out to Kane Hodder, who played Jason of Friday the 13th, I think 4 or 5 times?
No, we haven't. Only because there's just so many people we could tap into.
Yeah,
We do have Nick Castle, who is the Shape.
Yeah,
Michael Myers.
Oh, nice. No, and I had this is my first Comic-Con experience. I got a call from this woman, Danielle, PR. She was doing PR for Dark Sky Films, and Dark Sky Films had the Hatchet, and they said, "Hey, we'd like to embed you in our limousine," and.
All right.
Yeah, and so this is.
I never get calls like that.
This was.
Embed me in their limousine.
I got it once and never again, sadly. But I thought maybe I did too good a job. Okay, but I embedded with Kane Hodder, R.A. Millenhoff, who played Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Daniel Harris. You know Michael Biehn, right? Well,
yeah,
I know his wife Jennifer, and they're all in my video. And we were just cutting up. I mean, they're all the cast of Hatchet, but they're also in these other different horror movies. And I don't know if it's because of horror, but are horror movie actors the most real people you'd ever meet? Or they're just so nice and down to earth and cool to hang out with, and you know.
Like it's funny that you mentioned that. Part of the reason I'm enjoying this project so much is that I'm having conversations like this, real conversations.
Yeah.
And just with people that are just really cool.
Yeah.
There doesn't seem to be too much calculation.
No. Just that's it. Yeah.
I like that a lot. And also just people have been very warm and supportive. Whenever you put anything out on the internet, and you'll know this, people tear it down.
All
of this sort of stuff. I've been really surprised by how well received all the marketing that we've been doing has gone down, all the trailers we put out. I was expecting more criticism. I don't want it, but I expected it, and we haven't had it. And I think that's to do with the energy, and I think it's to do with the fact that I've made a conscious decision to work with people, to work with the community and listen to what they want from this. But it's unique to horror. Like, I just think the people are the best people. And you kind of get it because of who it attracts. It doesn't attract Joe Blow, average guy, that just believes everything and doesn't think for themselves. It attracts the people that are the quirky ones, and the thinkers, and the ones that...
The creatives. So it becomes... It's, you know why? It's creatives talking to creatives. That's what it is. You know, I think you said it best. That's really... This is exciting stuff, man. We could talk forever. I know you got to get your 2-year-old.
I'm barely awake. It's been a real honor and pleasure.
Thank you. We got to do this again, man. Yeah, we got to do this
I'm
again.
delighted to come back on in the future.
You got
and
it.
thank you very much for your time.
Hey, thanks for spending time. And folks, donate to this man's campaign. Okay, help him. At the bottom you'll see the link to his Kickstarter. Help him make it happen.
Got some amazing rewards.
You know, yes, and you know he says it, amazing rewards, and he's not going to scare the heck out of you, so don't worry.
Promise.
All right, thanks a lot, man.
Yeah, take care, buddy.
Oh, you
care.
too. Okay, okay. All right, see ya. Okay, got it. See ya. So check it out, folks, and subscribe to Zenny62 on YouTube, and we'll see you soon.